Welcome to Project Hindsight's Memorial Retrospective project. We're on a mission to get old-timers on the record about the good old days at Project Hindsight and what it was like to be there when Robert Schmidt was uncovering the Hellenistic astrological system to present to the world through his translations, his famous talks, and all of his important discoveries. If you like this content, please like, share, and subscribe. And please enjoy season 1, where we talk to Dale Nelson, Matthew Wood, and Kurt Manwaring.
So I'm so happy to be talking to you. I have Dale Nelson here. Dale, you're a longtime friend and supporter of the project and a good friend of Robert Schmidt and Ellen Black. And I want to talk to you about your experiences with Project Hindsight and with Robert's work. And first, I was thinking there might be some people that are sort of tuning in for the first time. They've heard about Project Hindsight or they've heard about Robert Schmidt, but maybe they don't have the background. So what I was thinking is that I'll challenge myself to give a very brief overview of sort of the history, and then I want to jump straight in as quickly as possible and talk to you about your experiences. Does that sound good?
That sounds good to me.
Okay, so Robert Schmidt grew up in the Midwest and went to St. John's College in Annapolis, which is the Great Books College that some people are familiar with. Every student that goes there studies the same, the Great Books of Western Civilization is what they all study. And that's also where Bob met Ellen. She also went to St. John's. And when they left there, they continued their studies and dove pretty deep into the ancient Greek and Latin. Bob spent a good bit of time translating ancient and early Renaissance mathematical works. In 1985, they started the Golden Hind Press with another friend of theirs. And the purpose of the Golden Hind Press was to translate some of these never before translated or lesser known mathematical works to get some picture into what the progression of thought really was with regards to this. And at that time, they also had a newsletter that they sent out, or a journal, and it was called Hindsight. So at some point along the way, Bob and Ellen became interested in the astrological works. Shockingly, so many had never been translated before into a modern language. And in 1993, they, converted their translation project to begin to focus on these ancient astrological texts, at which time they partnered with two other astrologers, Robert Zoller and Robert Hand, who were with the project, Zoller for a very short period of time and Hand for a few years, translating these works, which I want to talk to you about further. And a lot of times you hear about Schmidt as being a translator or Project Hindsight being a translation project. But when you really look at the trajectory of their work, I would say that the work, at least as it unfolded, sort of had a threefold mission, right? To where translating being an important part of that, but then also restoring the lost art, using those translations as a jumping off point to restore what had once been there. And then also getting at this question of what was the underlying philosophical framework that was informing this whole situation that they were getting a picture into. Who created the system? Why? What was being embedded into the system? And so I really think that, at least for me, I conceptualize it as sort of like this three-part approach to what they did. And what they did, it really encompassed many decades and is thrilling to track the progression of what they discovered and what Robert Schmidt in particular discovered. So I do think that he's best known for creating the field of Hellenistic astrology and best known for restoring, as he would say, restoring the lost art. But in my mind, I think that was part of an even bigger mission as well. And it links in with what they were doing before 1993, and then also what they were doing after his sort of reconstruction piece was complete. So, but it's certainly interesting to listen to his talks. His preferred method of conveying his discoveries was through an oral conveyance, not a written conveyance, although he does have some written works that we intend to republish here as well. So does that do? How does that do?
That is pretty good, and I'm pretty much in alignment with that. I get the same story.
Okay.
I would add that I would expand a bit on the pre-hindsight work that they did. He did some publication, but he also had things to say about it in interpreting, right? Aren't there some notes?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Clarify, like, basically he was mathematically inclined and science inclined, and at some point he got into the philosophy, I think probably necessarily so, at St. John's.
Yeah.
And so that must have been an incredible time for them to be, going into a position that allowed them to go so deeply on their own momentum. What they learned.
Yes, and I should say, I mean, he was deeply influenced by Jacob Klein at St. John's College, and then also Thomas MacDonald, who was a close teacher of theirs. Jacob Klein has sort of iconic status at St. John's. Thomas MacDonald, I think less so, but they were more personally acquainted with Mr. MacDonald. So
Klein was the dean for a long time, right? Wasn't he he fostered the program and probably influenced the original.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I don't recall what his exact position was, but he was deeply influential at St. John's. He wrote a book called Greek Mathematical Thought and the Origin of Algebra that was sort of famous at St. John's. I myself went there as well. I was separated, I guess, by a generation from Ellen and Bob. And but Jacob Klein still, even when I was there, had a huge sort of
presence. Even if he wasn't physically there. I don't know when he passed, but that may still be true. I don't know. But I wanted to say that Bob had been, and they had been together studying the philosophical background. He had penetrated some interesting problems in the mathematical side of things, and he was also and one of those sort of bridged over into the scientific, because one of the mathematical projects he had to do with something that Isaac Newton couldn't solve, had taken up. Apparently that was a problem that they had been working on. Newton and other luminaries of that era were themselves interested in some kind of understanding of what the Greeks had done mathematically, that they understood, even though they were making great progress in mathematics as we would see it from a modern standpoint. They felt there was something even better going on that they didn't know about. They had to recover, because historically that's the way it was. So by the time that Bob was introduced to the astrological field, he was well prepared, both because of the linguistic and the philosophic. He was probably without peer, I would say, prepared to take on a project of this sort. And the threefold, as you've outlined, I agree with that. And it was pretty clear if you look at the productions. There was a translation part, which was early on. That was a very big deal to people. It was what interested me when I first saw their little ad in Mountain Astrologer. It took me a while to sort of straighten out my own life so I could begin to get involved.
Okay, so that leads me to a question that I want to ask you, which is, how did you first encounter Robert Schmidt, and what captured your imagination about his work?
I knew it was on my horizon when I saw the ad for the first time. And, I never look at those ads in the back of magazines, but for some reason, that was a magazine that I did sort of glance through. Probably in 1993, if they had an ad then, certainly by 94, I was seeing it and knew that this is in my future somehow. I'm going to be interested in figuring out what, looking into it and seeing what they were really doing. I called Ellen in 95, as it turned out, just before the second conclave. So, and I couldn't make it to the conclave, but we had such an interesting talk. On the basis of that, when they were making plans for the third conclave the following year, I got invited down to meet with them for the first time as they were meeting up with somebody that they knew in Ithaca, which is where that was held. As they came up to make arrangements, we decided that we would have a meeting at that point and just introduce ourselves. So at that meeting, we went out for a pizza after having an introductory glass of wine. That should be a little bit of a laugh. But anyway, here we are in this local pizza joint, and as soon as we sat down, Bob started talking his philosophy, about philosophy, which I don't know how that came up, but suddenly we're talking about same and other. And I was primed to hear that without I grokked part of it. It was a matter of understanding that this was important to me enough so that I knew, okay, that did it. I don't need to know anymore. I'm following this guy around for a while, figuring out who they are and what they're up to. And of course, as you point out, it was like there were so many deeper levels of inquiry going on that eventually came out. It wasn't just a translation project. That was a big hurdle to get past, and it was part of the deal. But that was like, okay, he was the translator, and he had a very particular way of translating, which he made sure was known, that retained the enigmatic, the obscure sort of way that they wrote, many of the authors in the Greek. And he was very clear on translating close to literal translation rather than trying to get a modern sounding phrase out of something. Usually he was translating as best he could, and this was a big labor on his part, and I think he was applying what became known as the method of hindsight. In doing this, he was penetrating until he had a phrase about looking over the author's shoulder as he's writing this book. It was an experience he was looking for. He knew when he got to that point, he felt confident in understanding what the author was saying at that point. So I think that is a very rare capacity that was quite clear in what I saw going on with his, and he talked about that a lot in that Ithaca conclave. But that was beyond this was over and above what most people are coming in, and they want to see what's new, what's old, but new in our view, the old works. We want to see the techniques and what they were doing, and not so much interested or whatever about how it was that they were producing what they were writing. In the sense that, what did they see? They must have been thinking very differently in certain respects than we do today by habit. And Bob's mission was, in each and every case, to penetrate to something that he felt to be the core of the meaning for any passage, any phrase, which is not typical for, it is the genuine job of translating something so ancient. And I wonder, myself, I'm not a scholar in that sense, but I wonder what people who try these translations today, coming out of current scholarship or whatever, how they work it, do they have I'm sure they have principles, but do they work for the same kind of experience of really being confident in extracting from the text the underlying meaning? So Bob was doing this as part of the deal. He's translating, but he's also, when he started doing the phase lectures, which started early on, I went to what to me I thought for a long time that was the first phase lecture. I got invited to the one that preceded. There were several that preceded the 1996 conclave in Ithaca, but I started right away. I mean, I met them in, it was January or February of 96, and I went monthly to every one of those up until that conclave. And the conclave was sort of another level of involvement, because whereas, here was a large audience and feedback from a large audience, the phase lectures were smaller audiences with a lot of feedback from people and participation, but it was like he was laying out so much philosophy in part. And he would often say that he was surprised at how people were, asking for more philosophy rather than let's get down. He made that a point fairly often. But anyway, so I met them in 1996. I started coming to those phase lectures. When he started later on, there were some intensives as he got more into the meat of the techniques and things. That's kind of like an interlaced second phase of his development. He started working toward having a systematic layout that of the techniques that showed up in 2006 when there was a conclave in Cumberland. Was, I think, the first really public conclave presentation where there was a comparison among various astrological traditions. And by that time, he had a number of public and maybe some private workshops that would be dealing with particular topics or, partitions of the material that made sense to him from this wider standpoint. So he started talking about the cosmological model in late 1990s. And that proceeded. That would various focus at various times on partitions, methods having to do, coming out of what he perceived to be this model. And another thing that was interesting to me was some of what he did was to highlight the various paradigms that would be invoked, and by that we'd be having a narrative of a certain sort that would like highlight, even suggest the finer details of how rulerships worked, the relation between a planet in the place of another planet, and characterizing that as like an instance of the planet coming into somebody else's sign would be a guest, and there would be a host relationship, and then that extended also.
And that, I mean, I think that had a lot to do with how he was pretty insistent on translating the word domicile rather than calling something just a ruler, insisting on calling it, a domicile lord, because it's a very different thing, right? Like, I think modern astrologers say, this rules that and that rules that. That has a very different.
Oh yes, yeah, but that I think
that has a very different tone, and I think. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm just saying that came as a result of the attention he was giving to the language that he was reading.
Yes.
So that was by no means the only one.
Right. Oh no.
That's an example of the sort of understanding that became the living, the revivifying approach that the restored Hellenistic astrology seemed to be giving. The practical person who wanted to read a chart then has these things available to see. It's a matter of how do you see what's going on in the chart.
Yes.
And all of these things gave an immediate narrative for various things that you could see in the chart. There was a context in which you could understand what the implication was, because in the legal paradigm, somebody's giving testimony and, giving testimony again or whatever. The language shifted according to the paradigm that they were apparently using. And there was an overall paradigm that he considered to be the nautical paradigm, which was verified in certain places and tied was really a way of how overall would they see what is contained in the chart in front of them. Somebody reading a chart would rely on, and the methods would allow you to choose what, if you have, anyway, there are various rulerships of the chart that would get invoked, and you have to see that happening in the chart. You come up with a different example for any of these rulers, depending on what chart you're reading. So yeah. It's like the rulers that you would come to in executing involving those that particular paradigm would give you a number of rulers that would tell you how they all relate together in moving this ship image.
Yeah, and we can dig into that
represented the life of the native.
Yeah,
right, in a certain respect.
Yeah, and talk a little bit about the nautical model in general, just for anybody that may not actually be familiar with that work, if you don't mind just digging into that a little bit more.
Well, there are a lot of detail that I probably have to review to do a creditable job of it, but because I'm not practicing in that way at the moment. But if there were things that would be computed in some sense based on what the rising sign was, who that ruler was, how it related to another feature in the chart that was in control of some other portion of the mechanism for moving this ship along. And
yeah.
So it was sort of invoking a picture of you're out here sailing, and it's a beautiful picture, because here we are. It's almost like you're setting the chart itself up in a way that envisions that as a ship that sets sail. And so you have somebody who is in charge of looking out for what we're headed for and pointing out, steering it from getting the advice for what the steersman in the rear would be necessarily doing, because we're seeing rocks to the left or, pirates to the right or whatever. There's a certain kind of interaction between these things that would hopefully successfully navigate this ship to the destination. And
yeah,
that was basically the point of having something that could be said about what happened when the wind stopped coming, and how are you moving the boat. Well, there's a way of talking about how you'd have oarsmen that are assigned to help move along, or you see, it's kind of cartooning in a certain way to incorporate something about the nature of the fates at work and the response to the conditions in life that would come up. And it was very elegant in a way, but I think that anyway.
Yeah, and there's an analog sort of for the person that owns the ship versus the person that
right.
Is at the helm. Different. Yes.
Yeah. So there's the captain of the ship. There's the owner's representative, who controls what's the destination, because the owner is telling him where the ship has to go to carry the cargo or whatever. There's a steersman, there's the lookout up front, and there are other things that tell us something about when that wind is blowing, or what, invoking other people, something else that's going to be handling this, the oarsmen, telling them what to do when necessary. So it's a story that develops, and the intent of it is that you can do this for each chart. So it's a certain amount of work, and in fact, it becomes clear that some of the things that come up in the way that the Greeks apparently approached the chart was, there is homework that you have to do. You're not reading it cold with a client. You've got to prepare the chart and understand what these rulers are in this case before you ever start talking about what's actually going on in life with the client.
Yeah.
There is a preliminary analysis of the planetary strengths and so forth. All of that is preparation for understanding how is this nautical paradigm fleshed out with a given chart. And so Bob was discovering all these things, setting these various, like that analysis happens as a subsection of I guess he had three different basic divisions of techniques. One being the universal techniques that talked about the life as a whole in general. You would make broad conceptual statements. There was a topical category where you have techniques that go after particular, how do you handle finding the topics and talking about particular topics within the chart. And I think the third one, if I remember correctly, was involved with the Time Lord systems, which basically allows for timing of these promised conditions from the chart. There's a way of getting at the time in which you can expect that these effects would be seen. And they each break down. He had it all set up in this way, kind of theoretically, but by that time, the momentum was, okay, he's done translating. I think by the 2000s, most of those translations were done and out, and that meant that the game changed, so that when he had a weekend intensive, it'd be only a small group again, smaller than the Great Conclave. So it really, 2006 was the return to having a grand conclave, wherein all of these things would be explicated for the first time publicly together in a context where other traditions were coming into for commentary about whether or not what was being exposed from the Greek tradition that he's restoring had counterparts in other traditions. And so there were representatives from like the Hindu tradition, and there was supposed to be a Babylonian and so forth. A medieval track kind of comparison. There was plenty of things that would come from a later version of a Hellenistic. I mean, the later traditions would often incorporate much of the Hellenistic astrology, but then they would go further owing to cultural differences where the view of what was being done had changed enough so that it became something else. And what he was after, I think, was at root, as near as possible within his context, settle on what the original insight was, original system. And I think he did a good job. I think don't you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I had attended as much as I could, given the life I was leading at that time. It meant that I would be spending weekends very often down there in Cumberland. I was living in Western New York at the time, and I went to I think I went to all those intensives. There were some workshops that never became an intensive, and there were certain people who were hanging out at that time, participating in a little workshop where particular details of some method or other would be worked on. So that was an opportunity for people the people that came in would participate in working with him as he was concerned about the details of a particular method. And I think there were a few of those, and I did attend one of those, at least one or two of those. But all that material showed up, as far as I can tell, showed up in either the conclaves that came after. There were two conclaves that came after that, but especially the book that he was working on for at least 5 years eventually did get published in 2009. That's the Definitions and Foundations, in which he was painstakingly going through the terminology across several authors for each concept, and discussing and also coming to some conclusion in most cases about how we might understand the result of understanding how things had varied even within the tradition as it was developing in the Hellenistic world over, face it, many hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Most of the authors that were being translated were from the period in the first centuries AD. And the idea about when this effort had started, the original founders of that system were several hundred years BC. I think that one of the final conclusions that he came to was that it was fairly firmly in that period, in the latter part of the 3rd century BC. I think that's the way to say that, which was earlier than the stated publicity date of like 150 BC is what everybody.
Yeah, I remember that time period, them saying like, we've backed up the chronology by 200 years. Anyway, I have this at the ready. You remember this book here? This is 2009.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the book that we got.
Yeah. And so the early translations that he did came in booklet form. So this is just an example of what they look like. And
it came out once a month for a long stretch, but basically once a month was the
and then it got longer. And I know he talks about in some of his talks how that came to be, because when he initially started the translations, he had decades of experience translating Greek at that point. So it wasn't difficult to do the translations. And so initially he was sort of churning them out. And then I think what happened is he realized what important philosophical sort of like territory he was in, and realizing that he was really uncovering a system that had some really core ruling beginnings, we could say, that he really became increasingly careful about. Okay, well, I really want to make sure that I get to the actual ruling beginning here,
which would be that system that he had in mind.
Right. And so then he explains, I can't remember what talk he explains, how then he began to actually take longer with each translation, because he was then concurrently doing this philosophical work of trying to understand what the underlying framework was.
Well, those phase lectures were explicitly an attempt to throw everything that he could from the philosophical side of things into the mix. And so I think what happened was that process as well. During that period, those blue books were coming out, and yes, he could keep that pace for a while. And I think he knew it pretty early on that these were provisional. They used to say that these would be rewritten with the more final version. It's almost like, understand that these are provisional as we're first opening up the territory.
Mm-hmm.
And they'd footnote it wherever there was a question. He'd have a footnote with laying out some kind of question. And but he was able to do that fairly quickly. But when he had gone through this philosophic process, there was a time when it really hit him that how real the result was of digging into this material. Because even though he would sometimes say that in the early days, it was very tempting to get into doing this as a translator, because the philosophical implications of something lying right on the surface was very inviting, because he knew there were other things going on below. But he couldn't early on probably spend too much time digging into that. In every case, anyway, he could do a creditable job of sort of portraying what is coming out, but not the deepest levels necessarily in those blue books. But they're hard reading by and large, because they're not cookbooks for the astrology student. You do have to have a certain sense of, he developed it along the way. Anybody listening and reading them would be capable of understanding the nuances that he was coming to or making use of. And eventually it got to the point where he couldn't, I'm thinking by the time that he was understanding the broad outlines of this underlying conceptual model that was in play in the texts as he saw, that's the point that it would have slowed down. I think probably that's a researchable. We could see, what the dates on these things were.
I do have a document that I want to pull up that shows the order of the translations. But you touch on this point of the translations. These texts are incredibly dense and sort of difficult to read. And so, like, when you're talking about something like the nautical model of how he eventually described how one way of interpreting the chart or looking at the chart, it's not like these texts said, oh, hey, this is what it is, right? I mean, it wasn't that was his unique contribution, really. I mean, it's not just like, oh, well, we translated this as though it was, like a recipe on how to bake a brownie. And it's like, just simply by virtue of having the translation, you then have this nautical model or any other framework at all, right? I mean, tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, I know that because things would be clear to him, and I understand that on my own account somewhat, because having any experience of the kind of thing that locks it in, this vision of what's being said in a context in which it's being implied somehow. And it's really a skill that comes from, I think, his systematization of the method of hindsight is something that he had envisioned would be teachable. And the Institute of the Liberating Arts was the place where he would be teaching people how to do that. But you get it by osmosis. If you're there I found that you go every time there's a show, he's putting on a show, and you listen attentively as
Yeah.
you can, and understand something about how that works. You develop an intuition yourself to some degree, and it takes some time, and anyway, I think it's teachable. He was proving it. That whole method was something that he developed with his 20 years of dealing with those other scientific and mathematical problems that he worked on before he ever got into the astrology.
It's funny because I ran across the journal that they had from the 80s called Hindsight, where they were really dealing with this dense mathematical material that he was translating. And in the one, whichever volume of the journal it was, they have a little article in there where he talks about the art of hindsight. And anybody that's listened to his talks, especially his early talks, he talks a lot about the art of hindsight. And it's this ability to take an ancient work or, an old work and understand it on its own terms, right? Without our own suppositions or our own assumptions, to take a work and understand it on its own terms, right?
As the author understood what he was writing.
As the author understood it.
Right.
I mean, in one of the phase lectures, he even goes through this process of saying, like, we don't count the way that the ancients counted. The way that we count 2, 3, 4, 5, we don't even count the same way they counted. Like, the same thing's not even happening in our mind. And until we can, like, at least begin to sort of approach or even like have a temporary sense or feeling or like a fleeting vision of what that experience actually was, that whatever these ancient thinkers were having, that's the art of hindsight. And that's where you get your real breakthroughs, right? Rather than just anybody can just have a rote sort of like, oh, well, this old author says this, and I'm going to do this, I'm going to apply this or something like that. But the art of hindsight is something much bigger. And I thought it was really fun when I ran into that old hindsight journal dealing with the mathematical stuff, that even at that time they were talking about the art of hindsight and what that is and what type of purchase it gives you toward it into the mind of the thinker that you're working with.
Oh, right. That was another variation. Not only did he describe this experience as looking over the shoulder of the author as he wrote, which included understanding the terms, and he would also describe that as a meeting of minds.
Yeah. So
that you take in and know kind of, I don't want to say intuitively, because it is intuitive, but you have a certainty that you've struck gold here in understanding. And he was looking for that experience at every step that he would attack a problem. And those problems were big problems. I mean, anyway, I think he did it. And yet I also think that there's work to be done. And for anybody, who is approaching these texts, I can imagine that it would be nice to have some help with them, the way that we had him sort of convey in demonstration. But I think that's something that would be teachable. So that's, I think, an implicit goal for me, I think, to look forward to that possibility, that what he was doing is something that could, continue. And I think there's lots more to do on that front. I mean, in terms of what
there's
can
plenty
be uncovered.
of room.
He didn't translate everybody and everything, but that method.
Well, let's talk about what he did translate. So this is just and I'm going to put this on our website too, at projecthindsight.net, just so people can look at what was actually translated. Maybe I should make this smaller here so you can see. So these are what they called Greek track, right? Like, so it was the Project Hindsight initially had Greek track, Latin track, Hebrew track, I think published one, but this is what I've got here on this document is what they called Greek track, which was a 16 volume, those little booklets. And then you can see here in 2005, he translated some additional things that they called the source book of Hellenistic astrology. And then in 2009, the book that I showed, that we talked about earlier, that I showed, definitions and foundations.
Right. And you could see that, what was that in 2001?
Yes.
That source book, I think, is the one that went to Kepler College.
That's
so
right.
they would have been
That's right.
using that as a text.
Yes. And so part of what I need to
late Valens in 2001. That was the last one he translated.
Yes.
And published.
Yeah. I can make this bigger again. Yeah. So anyway, so hopefully that's somewhat helpful. But so he didn't translate everything, but let's talk about what he did translate. The authors that he translated were not the original. They were not the originators of the system, and they reference that in themselves, right?
Right. As I said,
tell us a little
all
bit.
those,
yeah,
all those authors came in the late 1st century and later AD, which, if our timetable understanding the earlier date of embarkation on the mission to create the system, because you have to, I mean, I really took up this question of what were they seeing and what was their mission in putting this this astrology, this horoscopic astrology for the first time. But how did they proceed, and what were they following in the way of an understanding at the beginning? Those people were well equipped to be doing that, apparently, which tells me that they were philosophically and mathematically inclined, because they were all astronomer people and geometric people, and we're talking about the classical Greek period. The authors that he's translating, and that I guess are the ones that survived, and they were collected together in the CCAG, they're all much later. They're like 500 years later or more. So you can imagine that if it became public in 1st century BC or late 2nd century BC, 150 BC, from that point on, it was being taught, it was being inculcated and made use. Apparently, it became all the rage in Imperial Rome, because we had astrologers of that day in the courts of the emperors, and they had various ways of handling that, or what they did with the astrology that was there. So there seemed to be some variation in what was being taught across those authors. So this is like a perfect place to have somebody like Bob come along and say, well, in order to have a book and understanding what all the terminology is, we have to represent those authors and what they may have written around a certain topic, and they may have had certain differences of opinion or whatever, in order to have the method of hindsight be the tool. Because part of that method is you have to have probably 3 as an optimum, 3 sources that you're comparing and you're triangulating on in order to understand where the source of those sources would have been the origin.
Yeah.
And that's what he did in that Foundations book.
Yes.
So all across the board, these authors that are listed in those blue books that you had on that list, they're showing what they're writing down, they're presenting what it is that they know or do or both, but they're different people who may not have been in communication. So there's some variation, But he was able to show that in various ways, you had certain later authors drawing on certain of the earlier authors, whatever they were drawing on. It's the same source by and large. And then there's some other fluff that sort of, because of different times and places, there are differences of opinion about what they're doing. So there is that kind of variation there. But I think he was able to sort that out. And, his inspiration was that there was an original source, which was a coherent system. And that would have been whatever the so-called founding fathers would have been putting together at the time.
And the authors that he translated, they themselves referenced these legendary founders.
Sometimes,
right?
Yes, yeah. Legendary founders, there are 7 of them. 7,
yeah.
There are really 8 people, 8 names involved, but the final 2 names are considered as a unit because they work together. The Chepso and Pedicirus were like joined at the hip, and they were the people credited with making it public in some way. At least they were the official, let's say, the official point of making it public. Before that, there were 6 other names that at one point, I know that they were put into an order that made sense, and the names are not necessarily of actual authors who had books public, because my own opinion is that they were still secret while they were doing this. And that's why we have a stretch between the classical time and the first century CE publication, because it was a major job that they did. And they had a vision that held throughout that time, through successive generations, maybe of workers, of people who were in on it. And it's a bit of a supposition, but it's known that it was often that authors would attribute their works. They would apply a name of somebody famous in the past to elevate the sense of this is important work. Here, it was a matter of keeping it semi-secret, probably very secret, until such time as somebody was going to declare it ready to pass on to the public, to however that happened. And I don't know that we know much about how that happened, but I think there is a succession. Those names in the 7 sages or whatever, it conforms to the sense of what people would have done in terms of attributing various phases maybe of development. I think different concerns may have been, because there's some notion that some of the names have certain methodologies associated with them, but there are no books to be translated from those people. I think the only there may be people in the later. There's some indication that maybe a quote from something that came from those people would have been quoted in the later books. So that supports the notion that those later people will have, whenever it suits them, they will have sources that they cite that come from this formative period that was much earlier, and reflecting the earlier design of the system, the coherent system that was in play.
Thank you for addressing that, because I do think some people that are just coming in to this for the first time or aren't really sure of the orientation might not realize, like, well, wait, what was translated, or what, how did that all go? And so that's really helpful.
I think it's probably so that today, I mean, it was natural if you were there and involved in the development. I mean, you watched it develop over time, as I did. It was kind of natural to just follow that flow and understand that, while they did make some choices about what they translated first, And I think they made choices based on an initial sense of reading that already the first scan of the reading would say, this is good material to do first.
Yeah.
And not because it's easy, but because it has the feel of somebody who's in contact with the old way. And
Yeah.
I noticed that the first one on your list was Paul of Alexandria, Paulus Alexandrinus.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
I can, that's a good example of somebody who is readable, but it's readable in a way that it gave me a sense when I'm reading it that he's really in touch with something deeper than other people may let on to. So I'm sure Bob picked that up and did that first. I mean, I think that was the first one that he published anyway. And I know there were also later comments about the later authors, that some of whom may not have been giving that same level of concrete expression of something underneath. So they may have come later in the process because Bob was after that deeper layer from the beginning. I mean, that was part of the program. I think he was early on, not just translating, but already understanding that from what he had seen, things that are obvious on the surface, they're arranged in a way, or they just have the feel of the tip of the iceberg. And he wanted
and
to.
they're belying like a deeper esoteric transmission that's occurring. And he you know, I recently re-listened to an interview that he did in 2016 with Eric Francis, and he's actually talking about that first translation that he did. And he talks about how, you know, basically this esoteric transmission that's embedded into the system. And in that interview, he's talking about something with the mathematical, I think, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I think all along he was looking for access points to the deeper meaning too. So
and I think the access points would have been obvious to somebody as well trained as he was in mathematics and philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Because it's my opinion. I think I agree with the basic insight that you know, you're going to have skilled philosophers who were also mathematicians who had a mission to do something that had never been done before, but they saw the possibility of doing it, which was to construct a system that gave us the horoscopic astrology that is the basis for what it is that anybody is trying to do today, by and large. I mean, if you're at all traditional in the astrology you do, and by that I mean even the modern charts look, you know, have a tie to that old concept, but it's never taught, at least not publicly. I don't know if there's anybody in, you know, the remnants of secret societies or whatever that happen to pick up on astrology, because it is central to an esoteric thread. And if you have a group that's following an esoteric thread down over the centuries, they're not in evidence all that much, but we did get the astrology that gets handed to us as moderns, and by and large they don't have any of that really esoteric thing underlying that's transmitted. It's something that happens over time and by having people who carry that spark, I think.
Yeah,
there's
I
an
think
art
in
the esoteric material as well.
Yeah. I know that he gives a pretty good description in is it Wither and Whence, a pretty good description of sort of the the nature of the muddled waters, right? In terms of things that are originally transmitted in Greek, then getting translated into Arabic, and then from the Arabic getting translated into Latin. And then, you know, by the time that entire process has gone through, we're
It's
sort
like
of
a telephone game.
we're sort of lost in many ways as to being able. Yeah.
where especially as it travels through different cultures, it changes.
Yeah.
The underlying paradigms change.
I mean, often in his talks, Bob will talk about like, well, this is what it is in the Latin, and in the Latin, that's a pretty fair, representation of the Greek word. But here now, once it goes to English from there, it loses its sense of, whatever,
Because, and you'd expect that would happen because they're all doing translations. And if you're doing a translation in some way that's, targeting an output that isn't as deep as it is for Bob, right? You want to translate the spirit of the writing, not just what the sentences say. There is an esoteric element to it. And so that's part of the process. And I think he was doing that without, I don't know that he would say that hindsight is, or what he was doing was explicitly esoteric, but I'll bet if you put that question to him, he would have to agree that he learned that that's what it was somewhere along the line.
Yeah.
I mean, he was excited by the size of the problem, the extent of the problem, and because it was really in his line of development anyway, with the notions that he was working on, with everything that he did since St. John's. He developed a style that was his, and I don't know that early on he would consider it to be esoteric at all until he gets into the astrology, and then that would be something that would be an unknown at the beginning, and he's looking for something that's somehow embedded in layers of different translations or whatever. But I don't know that he would understand that to be esoteric until maybe later.
Yeah, maybe that's right. Yeah.
But yeah, so there's a lot of work there.
Yeah. What you're talking about? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, you're talking about this, like what his original intention was, and what his original point of interest was, and then how it developed over time. And it's interesting because I think so much of his formulation became sort of like the standard, like this I have these little booklets, and he made this companion to the Greek track. So I don't know if you remember this. It went along with it. And this is kind of fun for me to look at, because he's got this glossary of Greek astrological terminology, because of course he's the first person. This is shocking to me. Like, it continues to be shocking. Like, I think as a modern person, we think, oh, everything's been translated. Everything's been, surely by 1993, like everything. And it's like, no, it hadn't been. And so of course he had to create a glossary of his terms. It's like, oh, well, I just want to let you guys know, this is how I'm translating, as for now, this is how I'm translating this, and this is how I'm translating that. And there's so much that's just recognizable now as just like, what is the vocabulary of Hellenistic astrology, at least Hellenistic astrology, like how he translates, whether it's like, a decline or, it's just like, it just goes and goes.
There's a whole list.
It's his, this entire glossary. I was like looking through it, and, horoscopos, and how he's translating, down to like malefic, benefic, the words for all of that, the entire vocabulary that people are using is based on that initial effort on his part.
Well, that those last two might be interesting too, because the astrology that I started with as modern astrology, you wouldn't want to talk about anything being malefic or benefic. I mean, yes, benefic maybe, but there is something in the way of an understanding of what is even hearing that, it sounds like doom and gloom all the time, using terminology that is strictly translated because of it's a cultural difference from how did they view back then, how did they view fate? They had multiple conceptions that all coherent view of overall there are different facets, aspects of fate, and whether or not that held right on through until I think when Christianity came along. It was a long battle, but it undid the sense of the nuances of the facets of fate or whatever, the different faces and how they cohered together. There's something that was a very intriguing concept back in the Hellenistic day.
I remember him talking about that a lot. Yeah.
And so suddenly it gets flattened out, with the new way that was sort of beaten over, beating down anything that contended with it over the centuries later in the early era, the 500, 400, 4th and 5th century, and all of that was developing. This new thing, this Christianity, was taking all that in and converting it to something that was more akin to what they thought their religion should be. And that religion happened to become the state religion under Constantine. And so they were scrambling to put that in place. And that's where Byzantine Empire came from. They were basically, Orthodox Christian from the time of Augustine or even before. They were fighting among differences among themselves about how to use whatever Platonism that was going on. Often the Platonism of the day was used to sort of contort the thinking of they wanted to have it mean certain things like the Trinity and various things that were under development over several hundred years, probably more. Eventually it stabilized into something that they considered to be orthodox, which basically means this is the way you're supposed to think about it, right? But they relied on the Platonism of the time even to do that. Later on, Aristotle was picked up by the later church, so everything became as Aristotelian because that was leading them into this quasi-scientific thing rather than this other thing that isn't really scientific. They're trying to, anyway, that's a fate over a couple thousand years of what the astrology that survived to our day had to undergo changes, and because things were being stripped away, and understanding that of that first vision was being stripped away. And there's a question about, how do we as moderns deal with understanding what the ancients who actually put this in place, how did they understand the astrology? To us, that to many people who understand there is something to be gleaned here, it's kind of a golden quest to pull that out of the remains of the tradition, even in the authors that were translated here. But historically, there were forces working against that. That's my sense of it. That eventually,
that's interesting.
So people had to keep it secret, and yet, even in the 1800s, anybody doing astrology, they all had pseudonyms that they went by. It's like having a fake ID. One of the this is my pen name or something, and it's entirely different, and it harkens back to some other time or whatever. So, but a lot got lost in that process, in current sensibility of what the tradition was that they thought they were carrying. And so, it stands to reason that where things become lost, there's a tendency to fill in the blank
Yeah.
along the way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, it's not a purpose of, there is a certain sense of, there needs to be a kind of period in which you're comparing ancient and modern in a way that he was comparing between ancient authors. There's an implicit need there to say, really, we should be doing something that honors the origins more than what's happening in the modern day. But the modern people will maybe feel that to be a threat. And it's like, and maybe they don't understand that need, because it's sufficient to make use of what they perceive to be the tradition. Even if, although I have to admit that when I started astrology, it wasn't too long before I realized that we needed more. And it took decades before, Bob came along, and he provided a context that I stuck with for a long time, with some benefit. I mean, I there you are. You get a sense that it's all worthwhile. And I'm happy to see that you're picking up the efforts of the organization. And I know that you're involved at the level that would be assumed, given you've known him for a long time, you've known them for a long time, and we're good friends, and took in what you could along the way. And I can only imagine that you have in mind that, you want to you want to see that come to some fruition out there that hasn't quite happened.
Yeah, I definitely want to. I have such a respect and admiration for the work that he did, and for the work that Ellen did, that I take it as an honor that I can preserve their legacy and protect their legacy. And of course, I intend to get all of this back in circulation and reprint some things that need to be reprinted. And I think that there is an interest in what that they were doing. And I think that my role is to make sure that there's a place for people to fulfill that interest. So hopefully I can achieve that.
I would imagine there's interest out there, and anyway, you probably know more about that concretely than I do at this point. But anyway, thank you for making the effort. You're pulling together something that is admirable. So,
well, maybe we can talk again sometime soon. There's so many other topics that we could dive into. You started off on this fate concept thing, and it's like we could do a whole deep dive into the fate concepts. But let's call it a day for now. And I really appreciate you talking to me. And of course, it's always good to see you. I always enjoy talking to you. And
likewise.
Cool. And all right.
So we'll schedule that offline.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Whatever time is appropriate. All right.
Okay. All right. See ya.
Thanks for today.